As COVID restrictions continue to disrupt American life, the U.S. Supreme Court issues a significant ruling in favor of religious freedom. Catholic League President Bill Donahue, an attorney and research fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Mary FIORITO, offers analysis. And COVID-19 restrictions on religious practice in California are getting more extreme. The Archbishop of San Francisco, Salvatore Cordileone, is here on his efforts to get Catholics back in church. Finally, University of Notre Dame professor Carl Sneed joins me to talk about bioethics in his new book, What It Means to Be Human. The World Over begins right now.
Now, Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. As always, an important show for you tonight. Bill Donahue, Mary FIORITO, Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone, and Carl Sneed are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, send me a tweet. I'm at Raymond Arroyo. Lots to cover, but before we get started, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 5-4 last week that New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's executive order limiting occupancy in houses of worship could not stand. Cuomo had already rescinded his order by the time the Supreme Court issued their ruling, but the controversy seems to reveal an ongoing anti-religious bias on the part of the government when it comes to COVID policy. Here with analysis of the decision and much more is President of the Catholic League, Bill Donahue. Bill, thank you for joining us. Here's what Associate Justice Neil Gorsuch had to say in his concurrence to that Supreme Court opinion. He said, "It is past time to make plain that while the pandemic poses many grave challenges, there is no world in which the Constitution tolerates color-coded executive edicts that reopen liquor stores and bike shops, but shutter churches, synagogues, and mosques." Bill, how important was this ruling in terms of the protection of religious liberty and the right to gather for public worship?
Well, it only has limited application to New York, but nonetheless, they're sending a message. The High Court is sending a message to the rest of the country. When you have imperial governors, as we do in New York, and by that I mean someone who thinks that his powers are boundless, that his arrogance is such that he doesn't care about any other rule of law. He's going to simply, by edict, he's going to decide what your rights are. Then you need the Supreme Court to come in. I think every reasonable Catholic and non-Catholic understands that during an emergency, certain kinds of extraordinary powers should be granted to the executive. But that doesn't mean that they're boundless. And unfortunately, when you have people like Newsom in California, you have Cuomo in New York, and there are others, they think that there are no limits on their authority. And what Gorsuch did is give them a good smack in the face.
Look, I'll get to the legal aspects in our next segment with Mary FIORITO, but there seems to be an increase among some of these government leaders, an increased anti-religious bias, Bill. Is that what you're seeing nationally?
Well, there's no question about it. Just to get back to Cuomo for 1 minute, he actually said that my edict is going to impact on the houses of worship the most. Well, he kind of set himself up for that. Now, listen, there's an animus against religious institutions if they're Christian and Jewish. I did not include Islam. And that is because I've been looking at all of these different left-wing activist organizations, which are already giving advice to the presumptive President Biden. And that if you don't think there's an animus, go read what the secular Democrats are saying, Secular Coalition of America, and many others. There's clearly, we have it in this country amongst legal groups, amongst non-legal activist nonprofit groups. You have it in government at the local, state, and federal level. Mostly Democrats. We went after a Republican bigot this week in Indiana at the Catholic League because I don't really care what the source of the bigotry is. But religious, there is an animus against religious institutions, particularly Catholic and Orthodox Jewish.
I want to get your take on Justice Sonia Sotomayor's dissent in that ruling, that Supreme Court ruling. Sotomayor, one of the Catholic justices on the High Court, along with Chief Justice John Roberts, differed sharply with Gorsuch and the majority. She wrote, Free religious exercise is one of our most treasured and jealously guarded constitutional rights. States may not discriminate against religious institutions even when faced with a crisis as deadly as this one. But those principles are not at stake today. The Constitution does not forbid states from responding to public health crises through regulations that treat religious institutions equally or more favorably than comparable secular institutions, particularly when those regulations save lives. Because New York's COVID-19 restrictions do just that, I respectfully dissent. Is this merely a special situation when government had no choice but to step in and limit religious gatherings due to public health?
Well, first of all, the first part of what she said bears a lot of merit, and then she contradicts herself. So the fact of the matter is, as I've said, when you have an emergency situation, the executive has some extraordinary powers. But, you know, if you're going to say, and this is the problem here, there are twofold problems. Number one, we have a First Amendment right to the free exercise of religion. That means that we certainly don't have less rights than pet stores and liquor stores and tattoo parlors. But in the minds of many other people, I guess we do. There's something else going on here. I agree with the constitutional scholar Patrick Gary and others who have argued that we do have a privileged position in law, in the Constitution, in the First Amendment, that religion is not to be treated as equal to every secular institution. So I would take it a step further. It's not what the founders envisioned. So twice I think Sotomayor was wrong on this. And one wonders then, what would it take for someone like her to actually come down on the side of religious liberty? We've been watching her for a while, but we've been very disappointed.
California has ordered a statewide curfew to curb the virus, and Governor Gavin Newsom has hinted at more drastic measures that may still be taken. Now, California's placed severe restrictions on religious gatherings similar to New York. Will this court decision halt or at least stall some of those draconian measures being contemplated?
In those states where you have a much more reasonable governor, it will. When you have the people just as arrogant as Cuomo, as Newsom is, it will not. Because they'll say, well, what happened in the Supreme Court case there on Thanksgiving Eve had limited application. So listen, if you can go to Costco and you can go to hardware stores, but you can't go to church and you have 10 people. I mean, I go to church every Sunday. They have areas that are taped off and people respect it. And there are no cases. There are 0 cases in New York. So this is a red herring. At the very least, we have to be treated equal to secular institutions. I would argue that we have even a higher plateau than they do, is what the founders wanted. So I think it'll depend on the governors.
I want to switch gears a bit and talk about President-elect Joe Biden and the effect a Biden administration could have on religious liberty, Bill. Let's start with the man himself, a baptized Catholic who has been on record as opposing church teaching on vital issues, particularly abortion, marriage. Earlier this month at the U.S. Bishops' Fall meeting, Archbishop Jose Gomez called Biden out for his support for abortion, for the Equality Act, and other issues, while praising him for his immigration stance, for instance. How much of a dilemma does a Biden administration pose for the bishops?
Well, I think the dilemma is at the outset, because the bishops do not want to be in favor of Trump or Biden. They want to be neutral and certainly welcoming in a new administration. On the other hand, Gomez is no dummy, and he knows exactly that Biden poses a threat to not only on life, but on religious liberty. And we're going to have Cardinal Dolan of New York take over the ad hoc, the Committee on Religious Liberty, which is a good sign, because he flexed some muscles very well back in 2009, 10, and 11 when he was head of the USCCB. I'm fearful about what's coming down the line. First of all, Biden isn't in command. We know that. So it'll be delegated down. And the people who he'll delegate down to are going to be left-wing activists. You've got all these people from the ACLU, the Center for American Progress, the Human Rights Campaign, the big gay group. You've got the Secular Coalition of America, the Democrats for Secular America. And I've read everything they've said. And I've written about it, and I'm writing more about it and doing interviews on it. They clearly want to violate the conscience rights of Catholics, evangelicals, Orthodox Jews, practicing Muslims, Mormons, and others. They also want to roll back every tax religious exemption that's been afforded traditionally and by the Trump administration. And whenever you have a conflict between the LGBTQ plus people and religious liberty, they're going to say that religious liberty should take a back seat to these people. No, we're in for it. I mean, I'm reading now that they say in their documents, we have to get rid of the term "in God we trust," our motto. We have to get rid of the term Judeo-Christian. I'm not making this up. This is all out there. Read what they're saying. These are the organizations I've just cited. If you have a faith-based initiative under Biden, you basically have to excise the faith element from it in other words, secularize it. They want a totally secular society. And their idea of religious pluralism is to bring in every single religious group, no matter how small, and put them on the same level as Christians and Jews. And on top of that, they say every religious outreach program under Biden should welcome non-theists. In other words, let's bring in the hardened militant atheists who hate Catholics in particular, and let's welcome them in when you have a program on religion. This is just how sick things are going, and we haven't even started yet with the Biden administration.
Do you think the U.S. bishops will have any standing to persuade Biden, either personally or members of his administration, in their direction on these life issues? Or do they lack all credibility, or have they lost so much credibility in the wake of the sex abuse scandal and the financial scandals, the McCarrick report, et cetera?
My argument here, Raymond, is that Catholics can't do it alone. I think the bishops should fight it. And if they don't, they're going to be looked upon as losers. But they need to embrace in a much different fashion than they have in the past. And it's not just for Catholics I'm talking about. I mean, evangelicals, Mormons, Orthodox Jews, the evangelical community, they are the people who defeated Proposition 8. People forget that out in California. It was the elite, Republicans and Democrats alike, who fought it in the courts, invoking the 14th Amendment. So my argument is this. You're going to need a coalition of mainstream and rather traditional people who have traditional moral values, because what they're going to do is they're going to argue, particularly with regard to the transgender community. It's not even a community as such. They're going to argue that you have to have special treatment. I wouldn't be surprised if they push for affirmative action. They want them in every body. And that means, of course, that the boys can play with the girls in the sports and can use the girls' locker room and shower room. That's what they want. They're not hiding their agenda. I think this is sick. I think you have people who are mentally ill, who are sexually confused. We should be reaching out to them if we care about them as human beings and not using them as a political prop, which is what the Democrats are doing. So I think that the bishops have not lost their moral authority. It's been weakened, but the other institutions have been weakened as well. But what are we going to do here? Be a piñata, just a doormat for the secular militants who want to knock down every religious right that we have in this country? We have to fight back. That's the only way. That's the only thing the left understands is fighting back. And if we fight back in unison, we can at least stave off the worst of it.
Let's talk about the folks Biden's choosing for positions in his administration. He's been wheeling them out bit by bit. You've written about one of them, Tandon Rather, who currently heads the Center for American Progress. What's the problem there? And what threats do you see Tandon could pose to religious liberties? And can Catholics in particular trust her if she's appointed to the Office of Management and Budget in a Biden administration?
I'm not so certain how much leeway she would have at OMB, but the fact is that anybody who's the head of the Center for American Progress is founded by John Podesta. We know what their agenda is on religious liberty, and she certainly would have an impact. This is the woman who was the key architect who wrote for Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of Health and Human Services under Obama, the HHS mandate. In other words, everybody listening to this program, you've never heard of Tandon. Okay, fine. Guess what? She's the one who punished the Little Sisters of the Poor. She is the one who wrote the HHS mandate and the Affordable Care Act. He had more to do with it than anybody else. So we know what side she's on. We also know that she was involved with Podesta in that WikiLeaks email exchange in 2016. And she accused the Catholic Church of being misogynistic because it's against abortion. That's right. The Catholic Church does not believe that Catholics should have to pay for abortion-inducing drugs in their health care plan. That's what the HHS mandate was all about. It wasn't just contraception and sterilization. It was abortion-inducing drugs. And they wanted to force that down the throat of the Little Sisters of the Poor, the Catholic League, and everybody else. This is the woman who says that you're anti-woman unless you are supporting abortion rights. And on top of that, she's had her own problems. I mean, this is the woman who fought Brett Kavanaugh because he was some kind of a sexual assailant. In fact, he wasn't. But we do know that even when she was making those remarks, just for a few months before that, at the head of the Center for American Progress, she threw a woman overboard who raised objections to being sexually assaulted by one of her male friends. She outed the woman. She made her name public and disgraced her and shocked the woman, not just the men, at the Center for American Progress. And by the way, one of their goals at the Center for American Progress is to fight against sexual harassment. Meanwhile, she justified it with one of her male friends. So much for having women in charge of these things. When you bring in people like her, look, for somebody like Janet Yellen, I think that was a good choice in Treasury. She's a bright woman. I think President Trump even considered her. I have no problem with someone like her. But when you see someone like Neera Tandon with her pedigree, no, we Catholics have to stand up against it. We've already contacted Mitch McConnell, and we're going to be doing more to make sure she doesn't get this job.
There are quite a few groups, Bill, who have a hostility toward religion, and they seem to be lobbying the Biden administration now to roll back much of President Trump's religious outreach, some of those executive orders. One of those is a Secular Democrats of America PAC. They cite what they call the rise of Christian nationalism, and they seek to replace it with a return to constitutional secularism. What do you make of this group and others like it trying to remove religion from the public square or somehow demonize it as a nationalistic move?
Yeah, they always come up with these terms, don't they? Christian nationalists. I have read the books by these people, by Kathleen Stewart and others on Christian nationalists. They still don't know what it means. They don't know what it means. You know what it is? It's a garbage term to just simply marginalize people who are religious conservatives. That would be people like me, social conservatives. We're not religious nationalists. I don't know what that means. Look, in 1892, the Supreme Court of the United States said that we are a Christian nation. There's no question that the founders were Christian. Now, some of them, not all of them, were practicing, but they certainly, we didn't have atheists in there running the country, and they gave religion a privileged position when they put it in the First Amendment. So there's no question that what these people are trying to do is to say, not only should we secularize society, they really think that we should take a back seat to them. And particularly they're focusing on this LGBT thing, the XYZ people, and saying that somehow that they have more rights than we do. No, we're in for it. The Catholic League is up for the fight, though. We're having staff meetings daily on this, and we're going to reach out to other people, just like I think the bishops should do, because we can, if we stick together, I think we can beat the worst of it. But there's going to be a lot thrown at us because, let's face it, Donald Trump did more to protect and advance religious liberty than any president in the history of America. Biden, to the extent that he knows what he's doing, is certainly not on our side.
You mentioned this case in Indiana that you're involved in where a newly elected state representative, a Republican and an evangelical Christian, John Jacob, recently made disparaging comments about Catholics and Catholicism on his social media page prior to the election. Here are some highlights. He writes, the Roman Catholic Church is not a God, but rather of Satan. Is not of God, but rather of Satan, and will leave one under the curse of God, unsaved and on their way to hell. Then he writes, I must be clear, the Roman Catholic Church is a cult. Bill, these are some of the oldest canards in the book. Have you contacted Representative Jacob? What are you asking of him?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, we contacted him. We contacted every member of the lawmakers in their state legislature, and we just let them know that I'm going to give him until November the 30th to make some kind of a public statement or apology that he's learned his lesson, that as a public official now, he can't carry on like that. Otherwise, we'll take it to another level. He refused to answer. So now we went back and we contacted every member of the state legislature again, sending them copies this time of everything that he has said, and attacking our Blessed Mother as well. And as far as I'm concerned, I would call for him to be censured if he said this while a sitting lawmaker. He made them before, but he was running for this office as a representative in Indiana. We've asked Todd Huston, who is the House Speaker and also a Republican, not to invite him to the Republican caucus. This guy should be banned from the Republican caucus. A Republican should not be associated with him. And I don't want to hear from Catholics or Protestants who say, well, you know, he believes in religious liberty. You know what? Take it up with somebody else. I believe in religious liberty too, but I don't want to bigot against my people saying that I'm in favor of religious liberty. Therefore, you should shut up when I insult you about your religion. This guy's got to go. And shame on the people in that district for voting for somebody. Maybe they didn't know it, but they're going to know about it now because the Indiana press has been writing about what we've been doing out there. A bum like him doesn't belong in office.
Bill Donahue, we will leave it there. You can follow Bill Donahue and the work of the Catholic League at catholicleague.org. Bill, thank you.
Thank you so much.
To react to the legal questions surrounding the Supreme Court's ruling and COVID restrictions around the U.S., we're joined by attorney and the Cardinal George Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Mary FIORITO. She joins us via Skype from Chicago. Mary, I want to start with what we're seeing happening in California. As of this weekend, indoor services are no longer permitted throughout much of the state, and many other states are looking to tightening restrictions on the number of people allowed to gather indoors or outdoors, including the number of people who attend Mass. What do you make of this, and do you think the Catholic laity will stand for it?
Well, you know, I find it just from a legal point of view very distressing because I believe the bishops have made it very clear, specifically the bishops in California, that they intend to abide by safety standards that exceed what grocery stores are doing, what other public places of accommodation are doing. I mean, I know when I go to Mass at my parish here in Chicago, my temperature is taken, contact information is registered. I'm getting hand sanitizer that I must use before I may enter, and then there's extensive cleaning that goes on afterwards. I compare that to going to, say, my local Target, where I'm handed a card that I'm not sure that has been cleaned, and some people are wearing masks and some are not, and no one's temperature is taken. So what the law doesn't like, particularly the First Amendment's free exercise clause doesn't like, is religion being treated in a disproportionate way to other similarly situated organizations or businesses. And it's not as if the church is saying, we think that COVID is a hoax, we don't take safety standards seriously. I mean, no pastor in his right mind wants to see half of his congregation become ill. I mean, it's just sort of an absurdity even to suggest it. However, our rights to worship are protected by the First Amendment. And when state legislatures or governors decide to take upon themselves to legislate for the entire, you know, religious population of the state of California, that really becomes very problematic.
Archbishop Cordileone, as you know, has been very vocal about his position. What about the bishops' conference nationally? Should they be responding as a group rather than just a local conference in California or New York?
Yeah, well, you know, it's hard to say on that particular point, Raymond, because the diversity of each state and each conference individually, you know, is really very wide. I mean, there's, you know, you can't look at, for example, a diocese or archdiocese in a more rural state like Montana or Nevada and compare that in any way to a far more populous state with a much higher Catholic population, like, say, a New York or a California. So to have the bishops speak in a universal way, I think does present them with practical difficulties because there aren't universal norms that would apply across the board, if that makes sense. I mean, you have some rural parishes, like in downstate Illinois, for example, where, you know, 50 might be a maximum they get any Sunday anyway. So, you know, to try.
But Mary, I worry we're getting too granular about this and trading rights. The fact is there is a principle at stake. And the principle is I have a free exercise to religion. I also can take a risk management assessment for myself and my family. We've been all schooled about COVID. We know the highs and the lows. And the fact is if young kids can take to the streets and protest, they can take to the streets and go to Mass. I mean, I think this should be a preferential option for healthy people and young people. And I worry that not only as a society, but the bishops in particular are a little reticent to articulate that. And that seems, you know, a missed opportunity. As I discussed with Bill Donahue earlier, the Supreme Court voted 5-4 to bar restrictions on religious services in New York that Governor Andrew Cuomo had imposed on churches and synagogues. As an attorney, what effect, if any, do you think that ruling might have on other states where they're either considering tighter restrictions on worship or it's already underway?
Oh, I think it's definitely a warning, and a very clear one, that when crafting whatever new restrictions or regulations that they're planning to attempt to enforce, if religious congregations bring them to the court in the same way that the Diocese of Brooklyn and this particular Jewish, Orthodox Jewish community did, they will meet with the same result. So they better be very careful in how they are instructing people when and where and why they can or cannot worship. I mean, the First Amendment is first for a reason, right? I mean, it's the right, your religious rights, your right to exercise your faith in the public square does not vanish because of COVID. Justice
Right.
Samuel Alito gave a terrific speech on this. You can, your
Right.
listeners
Mary,
and viewers can see it.
let's.
It's fantastic.
Yeah, no, well, I'm going to play it. Let me play it for people. I have it queued up here.
Just as the COVID restrictions have highlighted the movement toward rule by experts, litigation about those restrictions has pointed up emerging trends in the assessment of individual rights. This is especially evident with respect to religious liberty. It pains me to say this, but in certain quarters, religious liberty is fast becoming a disfavored right.
Mary, your reaction, is it becoming a disfavored right?
Oh, it already has been in many quarters. I think he is spot on. I mean, if you look at even just outside of these worship cases, Raymond, you look to Masterpiece Cake Shop, you look to the Little Sisters of the Poor. There have been multiple instances where religious freedom is seen as somehow a discriminatory right that religious people have over non-religious people, rather than what it really is, which is the protection of Americans of all faith traditions to be able to practice their faith freely. I mean, there are states in this country, for example, that can no longer, their Catholic charities can no longer facilitate adoptions. And, before he died, Cardinal George wrote a very beautiful column on this where he said, if you had told me 10 years ago in the United States, the Catholic charities, who for 100 years have been doing adoptions in this archdiocese, would be told that we could no longer do them, I would have told you were crazy. And it's sort of started with social services. We look now, the Little Sisters of the Poor, twice brought to the Supreme Court. I mean, thank goodness the justices had the good sense to rule in their favor, and quite 7-2, which was not a small majority. But you do see the way in which religious bigotry is creeping in to sort of the national conversation in areas where you would have been shocked by this 20 years ago. I mean, Amy Coney Barrett's hearings for the Seventh Circuit, not so much for her Supreme Court confirmation, but you look at people asking her, are you a Orthodox Catholic? Does the dogma live loudly in you? I mean, things that I was very grateful to see the Anti-Defamation League, the Jewish head of the Anti-Defamation League, coming out in her defense saying these questions have no place in a judicial confirmation hearings.
All right. All right. Well, we're seeing the pushback on these religious restrictions, Mary, all over the world. This week in France, the bishops argued and won an appeal against a 30-person mass limit. And in Ireland, a priest refused to close his parish, saying he wasn't aware of, quote, any law against people practicing their religion. He could face up to 6 months in jail. Do you think these COVID restrictions on houses of worship may be awakening people all over the globe to their religious freedoms that perhaps they took for granted?
What it's, I think, proving to people, particularly people who are faithful Catholics who are well-informed, is how quickly the government has moved to, and not just the government in the United States, but as you mentioned, in France and in Ireland, how quickly the government has moved on religion, as you pointed out as we began the conversation, not a political protest of any kind. And it's really been very sort of, I think, a wake-up call to many people to say, hey, wait a second, who am I hurting? There's 10 of us at Mass in our little rural parish. Why is that wrong? But 80 people can crowd into, say, a marijuana dispensary, and they're not breaking the law at all. You cannot hold separate organizations to separate standards when we're talking about public safety. If it truly is a public health matter, everybody should be held to the same standard. Why are religious groups being singled out in this way?
Yeah, it is curious. I want to move on to another topic. Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron has filed an emergency request with the Supreme Court challenging his governor, Governor Beshear's order, keeping religious schools closed. Now, the governor said all schools needed to go back to virtual or distance learning due to COVID cases going up. A three-judge circuit court panel ruled against Cameron. In a press release, A.G. Cameron said, Kentuckians have a First Amendment right to exercise their faith through a religious education, and we maintain that the governor is clearly infringing upon that right by closing religious schools. The U.S. Supreme Court has already ruled that religious institutions cannot be treated different than secular activities, and we are asking the court to simply apply the same analysis to the governor's disparate treatment of religious schools and other secular activities. Your thoughts on this? Does religious education enjoy the same protections as religious worship and other religious expressions?
Well, absolutely it does. Cardinal George, to quote him again, had a very sort of frequent saying, which is Catholic schools exist to teach Catholic children the Catholic faith. The same for Jewish day schools and evangelical Christian schools and Missouri Synod Lutheran schools, all of which have a very faith-based approach to their education. But even going beyond that, just to sort of use some good old-fashioned common sense, we know a lot more about COVID than we did 9 months ago. We know now children contracted at a far lower rate. We know that mitigating factors really do help prevent the spread of the virus. I know at my daughter's grade school, she sits 6 feet apart from the person at the same table. They all wear masks. They all have their temperatures taken every morning. Religious schools have really gone above and beyond, like our churches have, to make sure that we're not putting anyone else in danger and we're not putting ourselves in danger.
Lastly, I want to get your reaction to a tweet that was posted on Twitter regarding Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Barrett joined the majority of the court in allowing the government to proceed with an execution of a person named Orlando Hull. Now, Hull was sentenced to death for his role in kidnapping, raping, and murdering a 16-year-old, Lisa Renee, in 1994. Father James Martin tweeted this out about Barrett's Catholicism vis-a-vis this death penalty case. He said, this means that Amy Coney Barrett, in defiance of Catholic pro-life teaching, has voted to execute someone. The death penalty is, as the Catechism says clearly, inadmissible. Every life is sacred, from the unborn child in the womb to the inmate on death row. Your reaction to this, Mary, and what do you think Martin's trying to do here?
Well, not only is that inaccurate, Judge Barrett did not sentence or condemn a man to death. A jury of his peers did. And as you point out, Raymond, this was a particularly horrific case. You have a young woman, a fairly recent immigrant to the United States, a young woman of color who was kidnapped, gang raped for 2 days, bludgeoned with a shovel, and then buried alive. Now, I find it very hard to believe. I accept the church's teaching on the death penalty. I am very grateful that Mr. Hall seems to have had a very beautiful conversion experience in prison. However, it's very difficult when a case presents itself to a jury with those kind of details, and the death penalty is something that the jury is supposed to consider. That's a very difficult decision for the jury to make, and I can't imagine, even if the court had remanded it back to the trial level, that the outcome would be any different. This was a very, very difficult case just in terms of facts. Secondly, Father Martin well knows, or he should know, having the level of education that he does, that the Supreme Court didn't rule on the morality of the death penalty. They ruled specifically on 2 issues here. First of all, whether or not the government needed to get a prescription from a doctor in order to use the drugs for the lethal injection. Secondly, they ruled on whether or not certain mitigating factors, such as the fact that Mr. Hall had apparently, at some point in his life, rescued a 3-year-old from drowning, that information was not given to the jury. It was considered irrelevant at the time. Both of those things, clearly the law spoke very specifically about it. Amy Coney Barrett promised, my Catholic faith will not affect the way that I rule. I will rule according to what the law says, because the judicial ethical codes require that I do that. The judicial canons, insist that I do that. And so she did exactly what she said she was going to do. She ruled according to the canons. I'm sure it was difficult for her. She herself has spoken out against the death penalty, but that really
Mhm.
wasn't the issue, the issue at bar, if you will. The issue
Right.
were these two very kind of specific appellate issues. Why Father Martin would have tweeted something so inflammatory, but also, frankly, so derogatory and detracting from Amy Coney Barrett's reputation,
Yeah.
to a group of followers. He has many thousands of followers, as you well know, who may not understand what appellate jurisdiction is at all. And I just was incredibly disappointed. You may have seen I tweeted back to him and asked him if he would retract it and correct it and apologize to Justice Barrett. He has yet to do so, but I just found
Mm.
that such a divisive thing to do at a time when the Catholic community, Raymond, as you well know, is so incredibly divided anyway over matters of politics and
Mm.
issues that surround it.
And I dare say Father Martin would be the first to yowl if Amy Coney Barrett or any of the other 5 Catholic jurists were to apply the church teaching to certain other matters, perhaps marriage, life, any number of them. I'm sure he would take great issue and umbrage with. So, point taken. You can read Mary Fiorito's columns by visiting the Ethics and Public Policy Center website, eppc.org, or follow her at Mary Fiorito on Twitter. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Raymond.
Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone is next, but first, Pope Francis installed 13 new cardinals at a consistory in Rome on November 29th, including Archbishop Wilton Gregory of Washington. It was the 7th consistory of new cardinals of Francis's pontificate. The Pope and the newly elevated princes of the Church paid a visit to Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI following the ceremony. According to the Vatican, the 93-year-old former Pope expressed joy at the visit, and you can see that in the video, and gave his blessing to each of the new cardinals. And the Vatican is looking a lot more like Christmas, more or less, with the arrival of its Christmas tree in St. Peter's Square this week. This year's specimen is a 75-year-old, 30-meter-high spruce from Slovenia. Also arriving in the square is this year's Nativity. The sculptures come from the Teramo province of Italy and are reminiscent of Sumerian and Greek art. The rather unique figures are cylindrical and are formed by overlapping rings. The official inauguration of this year's Nativity will take place on December 11th. The tree is lovely. On November 29th, the first Sunday of Advent, Catholic churches in San Francisco and San Mateo counties had to be closed by noon owing to COVID restrictions. What does this mean for the future? Here to react, we're joined by Archbishop of San Francisco, Salvatore Cordileone. Your Excellency, thank you for being here. You've called your state's ban on indoor masses blatant discrimination. Why? And why are they going on?
It's blatant discrimination because the state guidelines treat secular activities with greater preference than religious worship, which is, of course, a natural right protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. I understand the concern of health officials that when people are inside the same space for an extended period of time, it amplifies the risk of contagion because the virus is contained in that space. But there's no distinctions made among stores, whether it's a small drugstore, people go in, make a purchase and leave, that's one thing. But this equally applies to large department stores and retail outlets where people could spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours shopping for clothes, shopping for shoes, whatever, and stay inside that space for an extended period of time. The staff, the employees have to stay inside all day long, whereas we can keep our religious services to about an hour if we need to. And they're not making those kind of distinctions with regard to churches. So they're seeing there are some religious services that are where there have been outbreaks, but those haven't been in Catholic services. So they're not acknowledging that we have safety protocols that are very effective, and we have scientific data to show that they're effective. We're trying to be responsible, but they're sort of lumping everyone in together on this. So they're giving preference to these secular activities and even allowing these one-on-one services that involve extended time contact, like nail and hair salons and massage parlors, tattoo parlors. You can get a tattoo, but you can't go to church to worship.
Have there been any cases of COVID outbreak associated with attending indoor masses in your archdiocese?
I know of no cases of any infections even. There was the study done by the 3 infectious disease specialists over the summer who studied about 1 million masses over a 14-week period that observed the safety protocols that basically everyone is observing throughout the country. It's a model that was developed by the Thomistic Institute in Washington, D.C., and they found no outbreaks traceable to any of the masses that were following the protocols.
What is the state of affairs now? What are you allowed to do? I'm reading conflicting reports. Some say you're limited to whatever it is, 10 people at a mass. Others say indoor masses are banned altogether. What's the story?
It depends on the tier. California has a colored tier system. The darker the color, the more restrictive. Purple is the most restrictive. So this is what happened on November 29th. San Francisco and San Mateo counties removed from the red the next least restrictive into the purple. The purple tier allows no indoor worship services. It does allow indoor retail at 25% capacity. So it depends on the tier that the county is in. Marin County is also in our archdiocese. That's on the north side of the Golden Gate Bridge. Marin is still one of the few counties left in the red. Red allows 25% capacity for church services or a numerical cap of 100, whichever is lower. But that also is discriminatory because there is no numerical cap on indoor retail. It's an absolute 25%. So I think for them to treat us fairly equally, really, religious service worship should have a preferential treatment because the state has no right to say we're not essential. That is truly an offense to say that we're not essential. Of course, we're essential. But at least for equality, if they were to allow us 25% capacity without a numerical limit in purple as well as red tier, we would be happy with that because we'd be on a par with indoor retail. And for me, it's a reasonable restriction to ensure that people are safe during indoor worship.
Yeah. This past September, the U.S. Department of Justice warned San Francisco officials that the city's restrictions on public worship may be unconstitutional. And they pointed out that tattoo parlors, hair salons, massage parlors, other businesses were being allowed to operate between 10 and 50% capacity, while houses of worship were not. Now, you started a campaign, Free the Mass, and held a demonstration that got a lot of attention. Eventually, you were permitted to have 25% capacity or up to 100 worshipers inside. Now those restrictions are back and churches are closed, but salons can remain open and massage parlors. I mean, there doesn't seem to be any sense of what's at stake here or the disproportionate application of these regulations.
Yes, we still have the Free the Mass campaign, and I would ask people to go online and sign the petition if they haven't yet at freethemass.com. It's also in Spanish, queremoslamisa.com. But San Francisco at that time was being even more restrictive than California. So after this letter from the Department of Justice, they adjusted their local county guidelines. Counties are allowed to be more restrictive than the state. So the local county guidelines are now in conformity with the state guideline. But so now it's an issue of what's going on at the state level.
Pope Francis wrote an op-ed in the New York Times last week, and in it he takes a swipe at people who oppose lockdowns and measures the government have taken so far. He writes, some groups protested refusing to keep their distance, marching against travel restrictions, as if measures that governments must impose for the good of their people constitute some kind of political assault on autonomy or personal freedom. Looking to the common good is much more than the sum of what is good for individuals. It means having a regard for all citizens and seeking to respond effectively to the needs of the least fortunate. He did not address restrictions on worship and access to the sacraments directly. But do you feel you're putting personal rights above the common good by wanting your people to celebrate in person indoors?
I have said repeatedly from the beginning, when the shelter-in-place orders were first issued, I've said repeatedly that the state has a right and responsibility to tell faith communities what they have to do to protect public health when they worship. But the state has no authority to tell faith communities that they cannot worship or to issue restrictions so severe as to effectively ban public worship. So I agree that the state has the responsibility to protect public health, and we're observing these safety guidelines the state is issuing about with our safety protocols like everyone else about face coverings are required. Social distancing is required. The churches rope off the pews. They mark spots in the pews. They mark spots in the aisle for when people are coming up for communion. They sanitize the surfaces, pews, and other high-touch surfaces between services. The face coverings during communion for the communion minister. So we're doing all of this. That's not the problem. We accept that we have to abide by certain restrictions. As I said a moment ago, that 25% capacity in our churches for me is reasonable as long as there's no numerical limit. So I certainly have said all along consistently, I accept that principle, but I do not accept that the state can tell the church not to worship. Now,
what's the spiritual impact?
Worship outdoors. In some parts of the state right now, we're blessed with some good weather here locally. The weather is amenable to outdoor worship, but it's not going to be long before the weather changes. It's going to get windy, the rains will come, and so forth. So this cannot go on indefinitely.
Archbishop, before I let you go, what's the spiritual impact of this? The deprivation of the sacraments and people not being able to worship, particularly as we enter the Advent season?
Our people are suffering and they're struggling. I'm hearing more and more from our people. They want the bishops to be bolder. They want me to be bolder. The people are suffering very much from deprivation of the sacraments. You cannot live stream Holy Communion. And that plus the isolation, as I've said before, the church means assembly. The church is an assembly of people. That's our very identity, is coming together to worship God with and under Christ, or rather to worship with and under Christ in the body of Christ. So it really, in a way, goes against our nature, and our people are suffering from being cut off from their faith community, cut off from the practice of the faith, and especially the most essential part of the practice of our faith, which is Holy Communion and the whole sacramental life of the church.
Well, we will keep in touch with you about this, and thank you for the update. Archbishop Salvatore Cordileone, I thank you for your time.
Thank you.
He's a law professor at the University of Notre Dame and a leading expert on public bioethics. I spoke with him recently about his new book, What It Means to Be Human. In it, he takes a fresh look at how American law and policy might better represent the human experience. Here's my interview with Carl Sneed. Carter, one of the principles of Catholic social teaching is the dignity of the individual. In your book, you underline a new kind of individualism in the American personality that leads to really negative directions. You call this expressive individualism. Now, what is expressive individualism and what's the problem with it?
So expressive individualism is what I call in the book a kind of anthropology, not meant in the sense of the study of people living on faraway islands, as Margaret Mead did, but rather in its original sense of what it means to be a person and what constitutes human flourishing. And expressive individualism is an anthropology that was first named by social scientist Robert Bellah, who wrote the 1985 classic Habits of the Heart, when he interviewed hundreds of Americans and asked them who they think they were at bottom, what their core personal reality was, and what their flourishing was. And what he found out was these folks believed that the core reality of their lives were themselves as an individuated will, an individuated desire, independent of their relationships with other people, independent of their histories or traditions or cultures or even their very families, and that their flourishing consisted in interrogating the depths of their own interiors to come up and find the authentic truths that lied within, and to pursue those truths and configure their lives in a way that pursued those truths. And it was startling to Bellah to hear this account because it was so disconnected from our relationships, our formative relationships that sustain us, that preserve our very lives, relationships with parents and loved ones and wives and husbands and communities. He was worried about this kind of hyper-individualistic notion that privileged the mind and the will over all other aspects of our personal identity and defined human flourishing in this way that was so single-mindedly individualistic and selfish, basically. And this is a vision of the person and human flourishing that I find in my book underlines the laws and policies of abortion, assisted reproduction, and end-of-life decision-making. One thing that a lot of people who don't study the law carefully realize is that all law exists for the purpose of promoting the flourishing of persons and to protect persons. And therefore, all law has to have a prior premise about what a person is and what human flourishing is. And if you get that wrong, then your law is not going to be just and humane and protective of the weakest and most vulnerable among us.
In what it means to be human, you're right. An inexorable reality of embodied human life is dependence. Now, some would argue that becoming a mature adult is to be independent. That's what we want to teach our kids. So why is dependence a good thing?
Well, dependence is a good thing in the sense that it teaches us what it is that we're supposed to be. What I argue in the book is that by virtue of our embodiment, because we are embodied beings, and expressive individualism ignores that. Our embodiment is invisible to expressive individualism. All expressive individualism cares about in defining the person is the mind and the will. And the body is instrumental, our relationships are instrumental, nature itself is instrumental to the pursuit of our own self-invented destiny. Whereas embodiment, if you think about the lived reality of embodiment, the fact that we experience ourselves and one another as embodied beings, you realize pretty quickly that dependence, as you just noted, is an essential feature of that reality. We live in corruptible bodies. We can't get along on our own without the help of others. We depend, our very survival depends on other people making our good their good in an uncalculated way. And the most obvious example of that is our parents. Our parents don't care for us as babies because we have a contract with them. They don't care for us as babies because it realizes their unencumbered selves to do so. They do so because of our relationship as child to parent. And they owe us this uncalculated giving, and we have a claim on them despite the fact that we haven't earned that claim. And so dependence is important because it teaches us something important about who we are and what we owe to each other.
You name a few events in the last century in the book, including the Tuskegee experiment done on poor African Americans, the children of Willowbrook, and many others. Why did you focus on this and the development of public policy and bioethics coming out of these immoral experiments?
Yeah, so American public bioethics emerges from the crucible of those three signal events. The Tuskegee experiments, in which the U.S. government went into Macon County, Alabama, and systematically deceived and exploited an entire population of poor African-American sharecroppers, prevented them from getting treatment for syphilis. They wanted to study the progress of the disease in its natural state, untreated. And even in the 1940s, when penicillin became available as a treatment, they did not give the penicillin to these men and women. They actually worked, it was reported that they worked with local health authorities to prevent them from getting that treatment. There have been experiments done on children who had just been aborted, paid for by the federal government. And then the other example you gave, a series of unethical experiments on human subjects. The children of Willowbrook were intellectually disabled children who were deliberately injected with hepatitis. All of these examples are important because they point to us the human context in which public bioethics arises, which is the vulnerability that emerges from our embodiment and a mutual dependence. These individuals who were exploited were not autonomous wills operating at the height of their powers the way expressive individualism would suggest they are. So to build a public bioethics responding to that vulnerability, assuming that these people are different than the way they are, is going to produce false and inhumane and unjust outcomes. And the bottom line is that the solutions that emerged in reaction to those scandals were to strengthen informed consent and to strengthen legal mechanisms that only make sense if what you're dealing with is a subject who has the cognitive powers to impose his or her will and to define their will. But that's not true in any of these cases. The unborn child, the person suffering from systemic racism, or the intellectually disabled child at Willowbrook were not autonomous selves that we can serve by facilitating their autonomy. They're people that needed to be protected.
What do you see as the emerging issues in bioethics that we will be facing in America and globally over the next 10 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think the old issues haven't gone away. I mean, the issue of abortion is still very much with us, and as long as the Supreme Court hews to the unjust arrogation of power in Roe v. Wade, where they claimed that the Constitution itself forbids states and the federal government from protecting the least among us, the unborn child, that issue is going to be with us. End-of-life decision-making, as we have a growing population of elderly people, some of whom are suffering from dementia, we're going to have to continue to grapple with questions of end-of-life decision-making and assisted suicide. But the novel emerging technologies, gene editing, for example, remaking ourselves in whatever image we choose to do so, that's an area rife with possibilities for expressive individualism to ground public policies that are unjust, inhumane, and don't protect us rightly.
What do you want readers, the average reader coming to your book, the layman who doesn't have a background in the law, in these theological issues, what do you want them to take from this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that this book is actually for anyone who cares about what it means to be and flourish as a human being and what we owe to each other. You don't need to be a scientist, a lawyer, or even interested in bioethics to read this book and to get something out of it. This book is fundamentally about who we are as persons and what role that anthropological question plays in our lives, both on our shared lives as a community, but also in our one-on-one interactions. And the person that most embodies, to use it's not a pun, but to play on words, what I'm trying to argue for in this book is Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa wasn't a scientist or a lawyer. Mother Teresa understood that we belong to one another, and she understood that our fundamental obligation is to care for the least among us, because she saw in the vulnerability of the other the call of Jesus Christ to minister and support our neighbors, just as the Good Samaritan did.
Carter Sneed, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
What It Means to Be Human by Carter Sneed is available now at bookstores everywhere and online. The Spider Who Saved Christmas, my best-selling new picture book, is one of the top Christmas books of the season. It revives an all-but-forgotten legend surrounding the Christmas story, and it explains the origins of Christmas tinsel. DiscoverLegends.com has all the information, various retailers, and you can get your copies now at EWTN's catalog. They're at EWTNRC.com. And if you'd like signed editions, go to my website, RaymondArroyo.com. There's ordering information there for my local Barnes & Noble, where I'm signing them as soon as they come in. The Will Wilder series also available. It makes a great stocking stuffer for those middle grade readers on your Christmas list. The World Over is also a podcast. You can download us at iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. That's all the time we have for now. Be sure to catch us next week. Until then, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, thank you for watching. I'm Raymond Arroyo. Bye now.